Hey, this is Professor Homo. Welcome to EX11 Part 2, and I'm still going to do an overview right now before I really dig into everything. And what you may want to do is actually just when you get your files and you download your files from your server, you may want to open them up and look at them, because what I'm going to do right now is just review the HTML with you, just so you're familiar with the different sections and the different parts of the HTML. It'll be easier then to work on your CSS if you know where things are and what we're dealing with. So I'm going to just give you a little guided tour of the way the page is laid out, just so you're familiar with the way it's laid out. It's not going to be the most exciting thing in the world, but hopefully it'll help you once you start to write your CSS. And I'm going to use the page that I created here to guide you through. You know, here's your visual of what the page looks like, and I'm just going to jump back and forth between the HTML. I'm not going to even look at CSS yet. But one of the things I'm going to look at, the first thing we obviously have our head tags, and that's where we have our meta tags and our link to our CSS and our keywords and all that kind of stuff that's in there, our meta viewport, and even the shim, the HTML shim there for HTML5 browsers. That's all in the head tag. And then when we get into the body, remember the bodies, that's all the visible part of the page. And the first thing we have inside the body, sometimes we format the body with CSS, but we're not going to do much with it here. We're creating a section ID called container, and the container is going to be basically this thing. It's almost like a postcard looking thing that's on top of this other background, and this will have this blue background color. So there's a background color which is behind everything, so all these elements will not need a background color because the section container with the ID of container will actually have that background color. That section will also have a border on. I think it's a 12 pixel border that goes all around, and it's white. And we're also going to do a drop shadow, and you could use a drop shadow from that box shadow generator, and I just copy and paste from there, and I use a very light version of it, you know, meaning that the shadow doesn't, you know, it's not real heavy, it's very light. And where that is in the code, you know, here's the CSS for container. Since I'm talking about container, there's a width of 858, which is started, and that if you measured it, it would be bigger than that, because we also are going to have padding in there, and we also have a border on there. There's also 12 pixel border that is included with the width of that. The picture is 858, but we're going to add a 12 pixel border. We're also going to add padding to that, which will make the whole container appear bigger. But anyway, here's the drop shadow. You can see there's just a little bit of offset on here, and even 0.55 is the alpha, so it's kind of like 50% or a little bit more for the alpha, and you could just copy that down. We're going to use Calibri as the main font, and we're going to use Georgia as the serif font. You can see that's all we use throughout it. So that's our container. The container will also have a 36 pixel margin. So these things here will just start wherever it is in the container. So blue background, white border, 36 pixel margin. It's almost like a sheet of paper. It'll have the shadow. It'll have the border on it. And then what's going to be inside the container is a couple things. One thing is this picture. This picture is 858. It'll go right to where the margins are. So this picture is basically, you know, fitting in this entire size here. So there's one picture that's going in there. Up at the top we have a header portion, and we have an H1 tag, which you could see. And I don't know if I have to really point out the H1 tag. Here's you know, there's container, and then there's header. The H1 tag is the Janine person, that's her name, and then there's an H4, because we have a 2 and 3, I think we have different levels of heading, so I did that as a 4 because it's not as big. This thing is just an H4, and that's the dark blue. So we just kind of used the dark blue, light blue, and white are pretty much the color scheme here. So this is the H1, this is the H4, and then we have a section called Nav, and this is, I think, called Nav Top Nav, I called it, or Nav Top. It's called Top Nav. So this section for top nav is going to have CSS, because it's going to start off like an unordered list. You can see here, nav ID equals top nav. It's an unordered list with links in them, but we're going to put them so they all are in one line, and we're going to have to do some things. It's actually going to have quite a bit of CSS for the top nav stuff. Here's the CSS for the top nav, and you can see there's a bunch of things that happen here. There's the font size, there's padding going around the entire nav, there's settings for the unordered list, which takes away the bullets. There's display inline, which takes away it from being stacked on top of each other. It puts each line item basically in one line. There's some padding, you know, on either side of it, so that there's space in between them. There's a border right, because there's only one border. And then we actually have to make a couple classes so that the first one and the last one don't have a border and don't have have a space, you know, which is a little tricky. So we just have a couple classes that we're gonna throw in there at the end, first and last. Here they are, line item first, line item last, and they're going to be switched around so that this one won't have a space on either side of it. It won't have padding to the left, and this last one won't have a border to the right, because it would look odd with a border. The border's supposed to separate, so I wouldn't have a border over here too. So we had to kind of throw some extra classes in there just to adjust the first and the last one. And sometimes people use that if you might set up a class so that you have the current page. Sometimes people like to have the current page highlighted in a certain color, and they'll make a class for that. So when it goes to that page, it'll show a class so that the page you're on shows up a little bit differently. It's not all just generic. Right now, this navigation is generic for all the pages. So anyway, that's the nav top, and there's some CSS to do that. This is the image section in our HTML. The image is basically, I put it in a figure tag. Figure ID equals pic strip, and the image is in there, and it's 858 by 300. That's the pic strip that's in there, and that's all we need to do with that. And then there's an article ID called homepage, and that fits a couple things. That's basically this stuff here. Here's the article, and there's basically a headline, which I think is an H2, because it's kind of the next biggest headline. This is an H1, this is an H2. This making every dental, that's an H2 that's in there. There's also some body copy, and I think I just made the width of it like 67% so that I could fit this nav on the right side. And so that's what there's an H2, there's a P, and that's all in the article section, because that's all that's really there. That's kind of copy section. So that's article ID equals homepage. And then there's a right nav section, which is kind of, again, it's an unordered list, and we're not going to put inline, but we may change the bullets on it. I think we change the bullets and make them square bullets, and that's all we really have to do over there, except we're going to have to float it. We're going to float this to the left, and this should fit over here to the right, and we may have to tweak it a little bit to make it fit nicely to get some space in here. If we could get away with doing margin or padding, that'll work. If not, we might have to do a little relative positioning to move it down and over, because normally it's going to start off like up here, and we're going to have to move it down and over. So we may have to use some relative positioning to do that if the padding and margin won't do that for us. At the bottom here, we have a little section at the bottom. And notice that the float, we'll have to clear the float for this one. When we get to the bottom part, that thing is, I made it an H4. Let me see something here. Oh, I have an H4 up there. I'll have to change that. I think this will be an H3, so I'll have to change this. This will be an H3 down here, because it's the next biggest one. So I have to make sure it's not an H. It worked out okay because it has a class name anyway, but this will be an H3. And this is, I just called it call today, and then there's just some formatting for that, which basically clears the float. So wherever that call today is, it just clears both. It clears the float, and I put in the font and the size and the color and stuff like that. So that's pretty much it. And then there's some stuff at the bottom of the page which is in a footer tag. So there's a footer ID address, and that's this. The only part that's a footer is this stuff down here. And it might seem really easy, except that we have two lines on the same line, and one goes to the right and one goes to the left, which is a little tricky. So what I had to do with that to make it work was actually make the one float, make a separate class for the right one and make it float right, and the left one, just the paragraph, will actually float left. So I had to make one float left, one float right, so I kind of stay on the same line. And then that whole area actually has a particular length to it, so that it doesn't go across to the page, you know, or else it would just start off on the left. So I put a certain length to it, and I even did like a margin auto. Remember that this section also has a margin auto, so it centers in the middle of the page. Remember that auto margin basically gives the same distance on either side. That helps us center it because we don't really have a horizontal center for that. All right, and so I think that's pretty much it of the HTML, and hopefully that helped you a little bit. But basically, we have section with an ID of container. That's the big part. We have an H1 and an H4, which are just these things here. We have a top nav, which are these navigation buttons or links that are up at the top. We have our picture, which is in a figure section. We have another headline here, which is an H2. We have just a paragraph here, which we adjust the line height a little bit because it's a little spread out. We have an H3, which is at the bottom, and we could just use a class name for that. We have a right nav over here, I think I called that right nav. I'll double check just to see what it's called. I believe it's right nav, and the other one's top nav, so it's right nav over here. And notice that they keep the underlines. They don't remove underlines, but it does have square white bullets here, so we have to give it white text first, and then we have to edit the links. So the links have certain colors, because remember, links have their own default colors until you change them. And here's the H3 at the bottom. And then also there's just this little bottom part, which is all in the footer. So this stuff is all in the footer at the bottom. And we had a float, this to the left, this to the right. We have a background image, and I didn't mention that, but the background image is actually going to be on the HTML. If I go to HTML up here, you can see there's a background color, which is gray. Then there's going to be a background image, which uses this background image URL, and then there's the background image, and it's basically just a strip. It's 16 by 420. It's only 16 pixels wide, so it's a little thin vertical strip, and it's basically going to repeat X. That's background repeat X, so that's what it's going to do there. So it's going to take that background image and just repeat it in one direction for our CSS, but that'll give us enough to get us started right now.